A revolt is growing against New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs.
Things have happened, and we believe that it's time to ask for a leadership review.
25 presidents of PC riding associations have signed letters calling for a vote on Higgs' leadership. That's more than needed to trigger the review. Higgs is under fire most recently for changes made to the province's LGBTQ school policy. This latest controversy cost him a cabinet minister last week, and 6 PC MLAs voted with the opposition to force a review of that policy. For more on this story, I'm joined by New Brunswick MLA Dominic Cardy. Cardy previously served in Premier Higgs' cabinet before resigning last year, also over the Premier's leadership style. Mr. Cardy, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on the show.
So were you the canary in the mine shaft here for Blaine Higgs? I mean, what do you make of this movement within the New Brunswick PC party?
And it's been brewing for quite some time. That we had a very successful government in 2018 to 20, a minority government, led well through the first stages of COVID. We're the only place in the world that brought all parties into an all-party COVID committee to help manage the pandemic. But with the majority government elected in 2020, the Premier became increasingly, I think autocratic isn't an unfair word, and increasingly began to bypass not just caucus, but also cabinet. And that led to a lot of dissatisfaction. So when I quit in October of last year, that was at a point when there were already a number of my colleagues who were expressing real concerns about his leadership style. And we saw that come to a head last week with now former Minister Dorothy Shepherd submitting her resignation. So it's been a growing problem, and it's one that I think the party is going to have to deal with, because this is a progressive conservative party, and we can't allow a populist takeover by a premier who was elected on a mandate of being a progressive conservative, not anyone on the extremes.
Right. Well, the frustration seems to be coming from a lot of places, right? A regional vice president of the party says this is coming from Anglophone, Francophone, northern, southern parts of the province, the sort of the solitudes of New Brunswick political reality. I mean, how real is this threat to Blaine Higgs' leadership?
Well, it's a real threat because it follows from months of serious missteps where a government that has done an enormous amount of good work, and absolutely including since the time that I left last October. Just last week, the government signed a deal with the Czech Republic, with Czechia, got no attention at all because the premier was engaged in yet another controversy of his own creation that had just driven the government into chaos. We saw him, without recourse to cabinet or caucus, eliminate elected health boards in the province, try to unilaterally and secretly eliminate French immersion, the issue I resigned over. The list goes on. And so now you've got a significant caucus rebellion, a significant cabinet revolt, and the party itself, which has been utterly ignored under Premier Higgs' leadership. There hasn't been a policy review since he became leader in 2016, a policy convention. People are just saying that, look, this is not the government that we elected in 2020. This is not the premier that we elected in 2020. And people are asking for a change. So I hope the processes will be followed, and that New Brunswick will get a premier that aligns more closely with their values.
Right. So the flashpoint for this rebellion, it coincides with his recent move on LGBTQ policy in schools. That is not the totality of it, though, right? I mean, is that a trigger point? Was that the straw that broke the camel's back, or is it just the process around that was just the tipping point for people?
I think it was the tipping point that the premier has chosen to take a very sensitive issue around the balance between parental rights and protecting vulnerable kids in our schools, and weaponized it in a way that's sadly reminiscent of the sort of style we've come to see from Danielle Smith or some of the American Republicans who've dominated our TV screens over the last few years. And the fact that he adopted that approach and did it without any consultation again, did it even initially without his new Minister of Education even being aware of the review. It's just, I think, really summed up for too many people inside the party all of the flaws with Premier Higgs' leadership, and really crystallized their opinion that there needs to be a change. Because this is the party of Richard Hatfield, Bernard Lord, some people who've made national names for themselves as being representative of a caring tradition of conservatism that's very much in the center. Last year, Premier Higgs brought on board a small right-wing populist party, the People's Alliance, that had 2 MLAs, brought them into the government. Now the former leader of that party is in cabinet as Minister for Public Safety. That decision was made. It's no discussion with the party, with caucus, with cabinet. So we're just seeing I think, something that is not unusual in the world. I've seen it. I used to work overseas in democracy development, worked with lots of governments. You see party leaders presidents or prime ministers who try and consolidate power, especially as they get towards what most people perceive as probably the end of their time in public life. But that's why we have political parties and why we have structures to try and stand up against the ambitions of any one man or woman who wants to try and dominate a democracy in a way that they do not have a mandate for.
But
Premier Higgs does not have a mandate to do the things he's doing.
you quit, Dorothy Shepherd quit last week as a minister over Higgs' leadership style. If it's as bad as you say, why haven't there been more resignations, more defections, more departures? We saw MLAs vote against him necessarily, but they stayed in caucus, and he still enjoys their confidence in a parliamentary sense.
Sure. I mean, I would still be in caucus if the premier hadn't hijacked a meeting of the PC caucus without a vote on Zoom and told me I couldn't attend those meetings anymore. It's being part of the progressive conservative team is something I think all the folks who were elected under that banner in 2020 want to be doing. The unfortunate reality is that in a system like ours, that we have a strong tendency for people to want to try and stay as loyal as possible, especially to a party whose constitution is one I fully uphold. It just happens not to be one the premier is actually paying much attention to. And so I'd flip your question around a little bit, though, because the reason you're talking to me, the reason this is making national news, is because having any sort of revolt in a Westminster democracy is pretty unusual. And when you have a large number of cabinet ministers speaking out against the man who can very quickly end their cabinet careers, I think that speaks to the level of dissatisfaction. And I shouldn't even say dissatisfaction, real concern and fear about the direction that the premier is taking us. Because as I mentioned around the issue around GLBTQ kids, it's the tone that he's taken, an issue that should be about what's that balance between parental rights and the rights of vulnerable kids. And he's weaponized it, talking about forced surgeries and hormone treatments and things that are incredibly inflammatory and scaring a lot of New Brunswick families on both sides of that debate. And that is not what the PC party of New Brunswick has ever been about. And I hope soon again that it will get back to a moderate, caring basis of explaining its policies and platforms, because that's a message the New Brunswickers can get behind.
Right.
This more extreme version, it would be really unfortunate if we allowed that to get a toehold in Eastern Canada, as we've seen it get a toehold with Danielle Smith and the UCP in Alberta.
Well, just as a quick final point, what are you watching for next in terms of this process, right? They're over the threshold they need of associations to start this. What happens next?
So the big thing is that with any sort of pressure movement like this, it's what's the target? And I think that the target has to be the caucus and the party's council, because those are the folks who can decide whether or not Premier Higgs stays or goes. There are too many folks, I think, still trying to hope that he will see reason and back away. And Premier Higgs isn't someone who backs away when he feels he's under pressure. He will double down. He will get more extreme. I've worked with him for a number of years. I've seen this close up. So watch to see whether there's further movement from the caucus and cabinet. And there's going to be a meeting of the party's council on Saturday, and to see whether anything happens there. The leadership review process, the letters that are being collected, there's a question of whether they're eligible for introduction at this meeting. That might have to wait for the next meeting, but hopefully there'll be some clear statements at that meeting about the direction that the elected leaders of the party, the feelings they have towards the current party leader, who is, again, really deviating a long way from our party's principles and platform, right, and from the election platform in 2020 that we were all elected under.
New Brunswick MLA Dominic Cardy, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me on the show. Take care.